I'm Connor Hopkins, and this is my Great American Orator speech. We were given this assignment in COM100. When I first got the assignment, I couldn't just choose one orator, so I did some research, and I found 5 that were always coming to the top. And we have John Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and Ronald Reagan. Martin Luther King was a civil rights leader. He was known for 2 of his main speeches, "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech, and since he was a civil rights leader in the time of segregation in America, his biggest speech was the "I Have a Dream" speech. John Kennedy, president, he was president during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is where he forced the Russians out of Cuba. He also gave the decision to go to the moon speech. This was a challenge to Americans to try and advance technology so the Americans would eventually be able to go to the moon. Abraham Lincoln, he was president. His main 2 speeches was the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address. Ronald Reagan, he was the president in the time of the Cold War. His biggest speech was the Brandenburg Gate Address. This is where his famous line was, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down these walls." And the Challenger shuttle tragedy, this is where a speech after the shuttle blew up while it was taking off. Out of all these 5 presidents, I picked Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A little bit of background on him. He was born in 1892. He was the 32nd president of the United States. He grew up around politics his whole life. He was the senator of New York. He then went on to be the governor of New York, and he was also the assistant secretary of the Navy. He served 4 terms. He was a time in post-depression, and he's the reason why we have a 2-term limit for presidents today. The reason why I chose FDR as an orator was his delivery and style. He was always optimistic. He injected humor. He talked to the Americans as if they were family members, like a father to a son type delivery. His use of the fireside chat, this is where he would sit down next to a fire and record himself talking to the Americans on all the positive things that are going on in the U.S. Historical relevance, he helped us come out of the Great Depression, and he led us into World War II. A couple of examples of speeches done by FDR that are still known today. The first inaugural address, this was in times of the post-depression, March of 1933, and his famous, most notable line is, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The Pearl Harbor address, this was done on December 8th, 1941, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the most notable line for that speech was December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Next we have the 1941 State of the Union speech, or address. This was when the U.S. was on the verge of war, January of 1941. Also known as the 4 Freedoms speech, and the 4 freedoms outline the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Next we have the Great Arsenal of Democracy. This was done December of 1940. This is when the British wanted the Americans' help to get through war. They wanted all of our weapons and arms. Famous line after this, Roosevelt said, "The great arsenal of American democracy." So we talked about the 5 orators that I came up with. We have Lincoln, JFK, Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, and Franklin Roosevelt. Others that always popped up on the list that were always at the top during research was Teddy Roosevelt, Williams Jennings Bryan, and Patrick Henry. The reason why I chose FDR out of those 5 was his delivery and style, what he said in this, or how he gave his speeches, his context, what he said in the speeches, his significance to Americans, and the use that we still have today. People still know him for say December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Thank you.